When I told a columnist friend in DC at the Washington Post how fortunate we were just last week to recruit Matthew Goodwin to speak with us today, especially after Pippa Norris was unable to be with us, he said, wow, Eric Kaufman 2 years ago, and then Matthew Goodwin this time, you've got effectively probably the two most compelling voices in the world, the most clarion defenders of national populism. So that will be our setup. Matt, I'm not sure if that's exactly how you'd put it, but it's a privilege for us to have you here. Thank you for arranging quickly to be here. It's equally an honor to have with us for the first time at Faith Angle Ed Luce, who, as you know, is national editor at Financial Times. In the next 50 minutes, these two speakers, zooming back from France, are going to help us better understand the roots for a mostly unexpected movement that's gripped much of the Western world in the last decade. Matt's going to start off by speaking for 30 minutes. Then Ed's going to reflect on these same themes for about 20 minutes or so before we open things up. And because Anne Applebaum and Eric Kaufman led a conversation on a similar topic 2 years ago, we're going to jump straight in to introductions so that they can start us off. Matt Goodwin wears two hats today. He is both a professor of politics at the University of Kent, where he's taught since 2015, and 7 years before that at Nottingham and Manchester. And he was recently named director of the Center for UK Prosperity at the Legatum Institute in London. He's definitely got something to say, even if it's not the conventional take. He's written 5 books. His newest book, still forthcoming, is called This England, Nation, Identity, and Belonging, 2021. His first book in 2014 was The Revolt on the Right, and his landmark October of 2018 book, which I have listened to in its entirety, is called National Populism, The Revolt Against Liberal Democracy, co-written with Roger Ewell. And also, after a 5-year stint as Financial Times DC bureau chief, Ed Luce became chief U.S. commentator in 2011, running a column plus editorials on American politics and economics. Ed previously had worked at The Guardian as a Financial Times correspondent in the Philippines and in London as a Financial Times capital markets editor. He's written 3 books, In Spite of the Gods, 26, about modern India, Time to Start Thinking in 2012, and as noted before, in 2017, The Retreat of Western Liberalism. Whether on television or in his own commentary or as an editor, Ed brings uncanny balance to some of these topics, which can easily be missed, and it's an honor to host him here for the first time. So Matt, thanks for coming, and please start us off. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Josh, thank you for having me, and sorry I wasn't here this morning. My British Airways plane was hideously delayed, and it was my first experience of traveling internationally in Brexit Britain and COVID world, so there were some significant delays. I am here to talk about national populism, and in particular my take on national populism. And knowing that Pippa was originally scheduled is actually quite helpful, because I think it's fair to say if Pippa were here, she would say we certainly see it somewhat differently. We do have points of agreement, but we do see things somewhat differently. And I'll summarize her take if I can do it justice along the way. National populism, in short, our argument is here to stay, that we are living through a structural, long-term realignment in political systems across much of the West, that many of the explanations that have been offered in the aftermath, in particular, of the 2016 political shocks, both the election of Trump and the vote for Brexit, were very narrow, were very insular, were very unconvincing. And for reasons that I'll set out, the roots of support for Le Pen in France, the Salvini brothers of Italy, Law and Justice, Fidesz, in some respects Boris Johnson, but we can talk a little bit about that during the debate perhaps, Donald Trump and his would-be successors. Those roots are very strongly entrenched and will certainly be continuing to cause similar upheavals, I think, for years, if not decades, to come. Let me get the definition stuff out of the way first. I am not like many of my colleagues in viewing national populism as being a close relation of historic fascism or as being far right, a very conceptual term that doesn't really help pin down what it's about. I view national populism as a movement that has a very distinctive ideological tradition in its own right, that is not like fascism. Fascism was revolutionary, populism is reactionary. Fascism was very openly opposed to the capitalist system. Most national populists, including those in Europe, are have largely adapted themselves to capitalism. Fascism was essentially about building the new man, a holistic nation looking forward. The core idea behind it, as Roger Griffin has talked about, was palingenesis, the idea of national rebirth. Populism is really more nostalgic than forward-looking. It's certainly not focused on building a new society through a new man or woman, and is certainly not as religious in its tone as historic fascism was. There's a separate literature that would argue fascism in many ways was a political religion more than a political ideology, something that I notice John McWhorter and others are now arguing about woke progressive politics. So it is a tradition in its own right. I define national populism as a movement that prioritizes the culture and interests of the nation while promising to give voice to a people who feel in some way that they've been held in contempt by a distant, neglectful, if not corrupt elite. And there are really, I think, two key points about the movement. The first is that the underlying drivers have been a very long time coming. There are four key drivers, I think. And the second is that because of that, and because of this realignment of politics that we're living in, these movements and this era of volatility will certainly be with us for a long time to come. And I was struck by the results in Virginia in the US, which again sort of roughly conformed to my expectations, given that we've seen very little evidence, if any, since 2020 of any loss of support or public appetite for ideas associated with national populism. If any, we've seen, I think, a relative stability in public appetite for those ideas. 2020 was not a convincing victory for Joe Biden and the Democrats for reasons that we can discuss. In the UK, Boris Johnson having a difficult week. Nonetheless, last week was still on 40% of the vote, something that David Cameron would have chopped his left arm off for. Boris Johnson and the Conservatives have cannibalized the national populist vote. About 75% of people who voted for Nigel Farage now vote for the Conservative Party. In France, we see fairly durable, strong levels of support either for Zemmour or Le Pen or combined. In Germany, the recent elections, the AfD was relatively stable, about 10%. Poland and Hungary, Law and Justice and Fidesz are entrenched, and we are now seeing national populism become a fairly permanent feature even in democracies that, when I was doing my PhD, were always thought to be immune to national populism. Spain, Portugal, Sweden, and in some respects the UK. Those were really the cases, sometimes the Netherlands as well, but those were really the cases that were seen as being the outliers, and now all of them in some way are experiencing the same trends. I can't really think, and perhaps this is a question I'll leave you all to ponder, but I can't currently think of a Western liberal democracy where national populism has become entrenched and has experienced some success and then evaporated in recent years. But we can perhaps come back and discuss that. And also in terms of demography, it's now clear that many of the early narratives that we were told or given about this movement have turned out to be very inaccurate. The idea, popular among my academic colleagues, that this essentially is a last gasp among angry old white men is really not convincing at all. We now have convincing evidence in Europe that a significant portion of support for national populism is coming from who one study refers to as liberal nativists, namely same-sex couples, sexual minorities who are very anxious about threats to their rights from Islam within European societies. About 20% in France, about 20% of Le Pen's support, it's estimated, are coming from liberal nativists. In Britain, the average age of a conservative voter over the last two general elections fell from 47 years of age to 37 years of age. Le Pen's support is distributed very evenly across different generations, Salvini's very evenly across different generations. We've also now seen rising levels of support for national populism among minority ethnic communities. I don't need to tell the Americans in the room about the 2020 election or some of the interesting trends that we noticed in Virginia. Same story in the UK. About 1 in 3 of Britain's black and minority ethnic voters voted for Brexit. If you view Brexit in the same category, I think it's a little bit more complicated, but nonetheless, we've seen significant levels of support, in particular among South Asian communities, for some of these movements. And there's also a growing pile of evidence to suggest that the young Zoomers, my students, my first-year students, for example, born after 1996, are certainly very socially liberal, but actually not as liberal as millennials. And it's too early to say where that's going, but there's quite a bit of evidence in, for example, the British election study to suggest that Zoomers might not actually be as culturally liberal as we often assume. And when you throw in a life cycle effect, the fact that we all typically become more conservative as we age, then actually the left-wing advantage, if you want to call it that, may well actually evaporate over the decades to come. That's just a hypothesis. I can't prove it, but it's just another sign that many of the narratives that we've told ourselves have really not turned out to be true. Indeed, Pippa's book, Cultural Backlash, which I would recommend, the main thesis of that is essentially Zoomers are becoming post-materialists, social liberals. This is Ronald Inglehart's old argument, and they are increasingly replacing the old nationalist, xenophobic pensioners. It's a very nice arc, very nice argument for progressives. The sort of history is bending in one direction. If you're interested, the British Journal of Political Science has just published a wonderful essay, which is open access, by an academic pointing out that actually across much of Europe that is not true. There is no clear generational breakdown in support for these movements. That the young are as likely to hold populist attitudes as the old. So all of that really begs the question of, well, if some of the narratives that we've had around Russia, Dominic Cummings, what was written on the side of a big red bus, social media, Cambridge Analytica, if these perhaps have been given a level of significance that I would argue is wholly disproportionate to their actual importance, what is really driving support for these movements? And I think there are 4 key drivers. And I don't think many political scientists would disagree with me, actually. I'm certainly on the end of the spectrum where I will argue now that there are lots of legitimate reasons why people are voting for national populists. But I don't think many political scientists would disagree with these 4. The first is distrust. Namely that we know we have very high levels of public distrust with political institutions, and not just political institutions, media, universities, cultural institutions, big business. If you look, for example, at the US Pew Research Center data, public attitudes towards universities, public confidence among conservatives and Republicans over the last 10 years or so has declined considerably, and that is also true of a number of other key institutions in society, business, politics, and so forth. I don't think that's really a particularly revelatory point. The deeper point about distrust is that as long as we've had democracy, and we haven't really had democracy for that long, we've really only had mass democracy for about 100 years. The idea obviously goes back much further. We've had human civilization as we would recognize it for 6,000 years. Democracy is a very young project in the form that we currently experience it today. But throughout that tradition, we've always had a tradition of elite skepticism of the masses. And that's found its expression through elite theories of democracy. It's found its expression through the current focus on governance, international governance structures, and in other ways. But we've always had an instinctive suspicion of the masses among political elites. Plato, obviously, was very fearful that the masses would be swayed by demagogues, and talked about the need of having philosopher kings in order to lead society and to keep the masses essentially at bay. The rise of fascism, McCarthyism, Pugilism in France, here in France, really fueled those fears that actually ultimately the masses could not be trusted, and that as we went through the 50s and the 60s, we had a lot of elite theories of democracy from Harvard and elsewhere, which essentially argued that the true essence of democracy was not mass participation, but was government by enlightened elites, by a set of competing elites. And that really set the stage for the rise of governance structures. We had World Trade Organization, IMF, European Union, and so forth, that really were seen by many voters and others to promote liberal, cosmopolitan, progressive ideas, and went hand in hand with a permissive consensus that essentially the idea was that citizens would defer to their elites on these questions of international policy and governance, and that they were happy to do so. It was best reflected in the statement by Jean-Claude Juncker, and I quote directly, "We decree something, then float it, and wait some time to see what happens. If no clamour occurs and no big fuss follows, because most people do not grasp what has been decided, we continue step by step until the point of no return is reached." And that was a nice quote that really symbolised this intrinsic suspicion of the masses. The European Union, not only being an example of the push towards governance, but was also not a democratic organization, and still isn't. As many scholars have argued, you really need three things to be considered truly democratic. You need to have regular elections, you need to give voters influence over who is representing them in the main legislature, but you also need to allow people to have serious influence over executive office. The European Union does not do that. It certainly allows people to vote every 5 years, and it allows them to have representatives in the European Parliament, but it does not give people any serious democratic sway over executive office. And of course, many voters, especially in the UK, could see that, which is why their concern over that democratic deficit emerged as a significant predictor of the vote for Brexit. This suspicion of the masses was compounded and is being compounded today by the rise of a much more ideologically homogenous and insular elite, a loss of voice for all of the groups that are now most likely to vote for national populism. Working class voters, non-graduates in particular. If you look across the House of Commons, Congress, European Union, think tanks, media, culture, arts, commentators, newspaper editors, those groups are really only noteworthy because of their absence. If you look at the House of Commons today, about 93% of MPs are part of the university class. Labour MPs today more likely than Conservative MPs to have a university degree. I don't feel like I'm telling you anything at the moment you don't already know, but this loss of voice for millions of people in all of the most important and influential institutions that decide how we speak about the country, how we talk about the country, how we represent the country, is something that I think we don't really talk enough about. There have never been fewer working class MPs across Europe's political systems. A wonderful book, if you're interested in this, Diploma Democracy, which shows crucially this isn't only about descriptive representation, this is also about symbolic representation. There is an exclusion bias at the heart of most European political systems, and I would also argue in the US, as Nicholas Carnes and others have shown, whereby the policy-making process is now skewed overwhelmingly toward the interests of high-income and, more importantly, culturally liberal groups within those institutions. We've got lots of research in the UK and Europe to show that the preferences of the majority on issues around welfare, on issues around migration, have been consistently ignored, if not mocked. And that's really gone hand in hand with the rise of new concerns over social status that are fueling this sense of distrust. I'm glad to see status is back in fashion. Michael Sandel, David Goodhart, Adrian Wooldridge, and others have returned to Michael Young, Seymour Lipset, to really go back to talk about social status as a major driver of concern and a major driver of support for national populism. if you look at the way in which our meritocratic societies, and I'm not a critic of meritocracy, I'm the first person in my family to go to university, so I'm always bemused by my colleagues that are very critical of meritocracy. I can see the value in it, but it has nonetheless contributed to a new social status hierarchy in society, whereby if you look at the UK and you look at the relative performance of, say, working class kids, especially white working class boys, they are now the least likely of all groups to get a good set of grades at high school, to go to university, to go to an elite university. The only group that performs worse than that group today are kids from gypsy, Irish, traveller families. The most progress that's been made within the UK education system, Chinese kids, Indian, increasingly Pakistani, Bangladeshi men. But the plight of white working class kids is just not fashionable enough, really, to get onto the agenda. And Rob Henderson and others have talked about this, that as we've had political institutions, other institutions really be dominated by university graduates, and not just graduates, but highly culturally liberal and increasingly ideologically detached graduates. And I've got lots of survey evidence if you're really bored, and I can talk you through just how detached these groups are from the average person, especially on cultural issues, that's really given rise to this sort of luxury belief class, whereby wokeism has become a new status symbol. If you look at the surveys in the UK, for example, middle class professionals are much more likely to have heard about wokeism, to say they think it's a good idea, to be aware of key terms and the vocabulary that goes with that belief system than their working class non-graduate counterparts. And as we've all become more affluent over the last half century, we've all been able to go on holidays, the old markers of social status, a new status marker, I think for many people, is very much around progressive woke beliefs. And that again has compounded the fact that for the groups that are most likely to vote for national populism, they are at the bottom of the status hierarchy, not only because they've not got the elite education, the elite degree from the elite university, and they haven't got the cultural capital that comes with having social networks that are filled with other graduates, and mum and dad didn't go to the same elite university, but they're now also at the bottom of that status hierarchy because they are having to apologize for who they are and having to atone for something that they really had nothing to do with. So distrust is sort of widespread, and we go into a lot more detail in the book. It's also being compounded by widespread fears, and I won't spend too long on this point because I know that Eric Kaufman has made this argument much more eloquently than me, but has been compounded by widespread fears over migration and ethnic change, and in particular how those are seen to be destroying established ways of life, national communities, and identities. So this second theme of destruction is fundamentally central to the rise of national populism. The evidence on this is overwhelming. I've done a meta-analysis with Eric. Many other colleagues who are at the other end of the spectrum have done the same. Demographic change is intimately related to the rise of populism, that if you have sudden, sharp increases in migration, support for populism goes up. As demography changes rapidly, the salience of immigration increases, and voters are more likely to turn to populism. Now, what's interesting about Brexit Britain is ever since people voted for Brexit and ever since Parliament decided to actually respect that and put it through, public concern over immigration has collapsed. In fact, not only that, but the British public have become much more positive about immigration on every major measure. British Election Study, British Social Attitude Survey, they've become more positive about the effects of immigration, have become more positive about how they perceive it to be impacting on the country, largely because of two things. One is our Remainer citizens, the people who wanted to remain in the EU, have basically replicated white graduate liberals in the US. They've become much more pro-immigration, pro-diversity. They've become much more committed to the European Union. But it's been matched by Leavers becoming much more positive about migration because they now feel that they have control over an issue that previously they felt they did not have control over. So those two things have come together, and now as a consequence, immigration is less of a toxic issue than it was before the referendum. Whether that will stay the case remains to be seen. Obviously, COVID also suppressed migration levels, And now with the murder of another MP, this time by, it appears, a radical Islamist, I suspect that over time immigration will probably come back up the sort of league table of salient issues. But in particular around these fears of demographic change, obviously we've seen the literature really move in two directions. Those who say this is mainly the response, this is mainly fueling economic worries over jobs, housing, welfare, and those who say actually this is more about threats to culture, identity, traditions, ways of life. My interpretation of that evidence, and I appreciate people have different interpretations of that, my interpretation is that the cultural aspect of that is much stronger than the economic aspect. And to give you an example, large numbers of wealthy cultural conservatives across Europe voting for national populist parties, not low income, not struggling from inequality, and there's a cross-class coalition that is coming together around national populism that is not just about economic scarcity and is not just about working class voters. Religiosity within that has become quite important. There's evidence to show that the religiously active in Europe are less likely to vote for national populists, but more orthodox believers, especially in countries like Belgium, Norway, and Switzerland, have been more likely to do so. And we can see how Catholicism is a powerful influence in Hungary and Poland, where increasingly, today, in fact, populists are arguing that traditionalist values are increasingly under threat in liberal, secular organizations like the European Union. Those arguments are increasingly being attached to Islam, to the rise of Islam within European societies. The forecasts will suggest, the forecasts suggest those will remain very salient. To give you a sense, here in France, the share of France's population that is Muslim today is around 9%. It's currently forecast to double by 2050, which isn't that far away. And obviously Le Pen has tried to make political capital out of that. If you are interested in a very insightful book on the UK, Ed Luce has written a book recently called Among the Mosques, where he's gone around the UK and turned up randomly without any warning at mosques across the country and just observed sort of what's happening and has written his experience. And I won't put words into Ed's mouth. I would just recommend that you read the book. The polling evidence suggests that around 24% of Muslims, British Muslims, who feel very strongly attached to Britain and are very proud of their British identity, at the same time, about 24% would support prioritizing Islamic law over British law, either in some areas or in all areas, and would prefer to live separately to British institutions. And that's a very credible social science experiment study. That's not a random poll that's being used by a dubious organization. And underneath this, we know that the value divides that are driving this, and we know those value divides are very entrenched, have led to especially strong concerns among workers, non-graduates, and cultural conservatives who are often driven by sociotropic anxieties about the group. They feel much more strongly attached to the group. If you look at Leave voters and why Leave voters are different from Remain voters, Leave voters feel much more strongly attached to their wider group. They feel much more, they feel proud of the country. They see the country as an important source of status and esteem. Remain is obviously much more individualistic, much more focused on achievement, on attributes that are not necessarily ascribed. And we've seen that value divide not only power Brexit, but also go on to power Boris Johnson. And one of the reasons why Boris Johnson is so strong politically, with this week put to one side for a second, Boris Johnson essentially can stay in number 10 for as long as he wants, so long as he remains committed to the strategy that got him there in the first place, because he's put together a coalition that represents about 60% of all constituencies, a combination of working class voters, non-graduates, and also some middle class voters who prioritise their conservative attachment over any potential risk of having as they would see it, a left-wing government. At the same time, the Labour Party has become heavily dependent upon, and I think the Americans will find this story familiar, university graduates, students, minority ethnic voters who concentrate very heavily but narrowly in the cities and the university towns. It is impossible for the Labour Party, for example, to win the next election unless it wins back England. And by England, I mean non-university town, non-London England. And Labour currently doesn't really know what to do with England, because that means talking to all of the voters that voted for Brexit, or voted for Nigel Farage, or voted for national populism. So the system now is really punishing Labour. It's stacking up votes where it doesn't need votes, and it's losing votes in areas where it desperately needs votes, as indeed I think the system is now punishing the Democrats in the US. And at the heart of that are those cultural concerns over people's fears over a loss of life, ways of life, tradition and identity, which are not easily resolved. And it's certainly not going to be removed by a scandal over an MP that's got involved with some lobbying issue, and it's not going to be removed by the fact that Boris Johnson is, a clown with, dubious morals and etc. The realignment that is sweeping through, especially the UK, is much more cultural than it is economic. And that is also, I think, being compounded by an accompanying set of worries over relative deprivation. And I am completely won over by the argument made again this week that hyperglobalization has a lot to answer for. And I'm won over by work in economics, which has shown not only how the post-1980s shift to hyperglobalization not only fueled inequality, and in the case of my country, the UK, the highest rates of geographical inequality in much of the Western world. In fact, we have worse rates of inequality by region than some of the southern states in the US, but also has fundamentally weakened the social fabric of communities. David Autor and others have shown this, that the strength of family has been devastated by hyperglobalization. It's not just employment and earnings, and we can talk about what's happening to men in the United States and in parts of Europe if we perhaps might get into that. The addiction crisis, the opioid crisis and so forth, hyperglobalization for the very communities that are often voting for national populism has been utterly devastating. And at the same time, this sense of relative deprivation that my group is being treated less well than other groups has also been really strongly fueled by a complete collapse of bargaining power for those groups, the hollowing out of trade unions, the hollowing out of their voice in almost every major institution in society. And their group has found itself at the very bottom of this list. It's led to we're here in France, Christophe Gouillet's book, if you get a chance, Twilight of the Elites, a fantastic book on geographical polarization, in which he talks about the rise of peripheral France before the rise of yellow vests. And essentially his argument being that if you look at where we are headed with geographical polarization, increasingly working class non-graduate voters will be rising up against metropolitan cities where graduates, minorities and students are concentrated. And that is really fueling these intense concerns over status. Another reason why Johnson was so strong in 2019 was because he recognized that and promised levelling up. And we can all sit here and say, well, Boris Johnson's agenda on levelling up doesn't mean anything, but he was the first politician in a very long time to publicly campaign on regional inequality as an issue and pledge to essentially level up areas that had been historically left behind. And that was a big reason why he demolished half of Labour's Red Wall. The Labour Red Wall that you often hear about is only 50% demolished, right? There's another 50% that I suspect we'll be talking about come 2023, where it doesn't matter if Johnson loses Liberals in the South. It doesn't matter if he loses blue wall seats around London. There are a lot more working class seats to go Conservative. And lastly, as I know Josh will be getting anxious about the time, alongside these fears of relative deprivation, how am I doing relative to other groups in society? How is my wider group doing relative to other groups in society? The one thing, whether you're left, right, liberal, conservative, whatever, the one thing no serious social scientist would disagree about at the moment is that we are in a new era of de-alignment, that the bonds between voters and parties have completely broken down, right? Party identification, whatever Western democracy you look at, party identification has become much, much weaker. Levels of volatility, namely people switching their vote from one election to the next, are at record highs. I think I'm right in saying in the US, record shares of independence at the moment, or certainly over the last 5 years. The UK, we've never had as many people switching their vote from one party to the next, outside of those more tribal groups. Social democracy has increasingly suffered as a result of that. It's lost its historic tribal allegiances. But one hypothesis that I'll leave hanging in the air, and this is probably something for somebody else to do, sort of a PhD in the future, my suspicion is Western Europe and increasingly North America are going to go the way that Central and Eastern Europe have gone, where you have, the difference between Central and Eastern Europe and Western Europe and North America is they didn't have a very deep foundation to electoral politics because of communism, because of the dominance of the Cold War, etc. So what you have in Central and Eastern Europe are much higher rates of volatility. So you have parties coming and going very quickly in different formations. Italy right now is a primary example. Salvini is no longer number one. The brothers of Italy are number one, who are even more extreme than Salvini. Le Pen is no longer number one. Zemmour is now ahead of Le Pen in some of the polls. Farage emerges in the UK, is then eclipsed by Boris Johnson. Donald Trump emerges in 2016, loses 2020. Who emerges in 2024? I don't know, let's see. But it may be that Western Europe and North America are now going to increasingly emulate Central and East European states with much higher rates of volatility, making politics even less predictable than it currently is, much more chaotic, much more fragmented, making it harder for European nations, especially within the EU, to forge the strong governments that they need. Witness the recent election in Germany, witness Belgium, Netherlands, record periods of time to form governments, Italy. And over time, the foundations of the model of politics that dominated the second half of the 20th century increasingly just sort of looks like a relic from a bygone past. Ideologies, parties that have been created for an era in which left and right were the dominant drivers are now struggling to make way for this four-dimensional space where it's no longer left and right, it's left, right, and liberal conservative, now all competing amid these high rates of volatility. And I suspect that will keep political scientists in business for a long period of time, but it will ultimately mean that we may just have a lot of trendless fluctuation in which populism is a permanent feature on the landscape. It's not always winning elections, it's not always changing necessarily the public policy process, but it's nonetheless a permanent feature. Graduate liberals are increasingly drifting into green, radical left parties outside of the traditional center-left, and it leaves us with this more mosaic view of politics where it's just becoming harder and harder to form cohesive coalitions and harder to give people unifying narratives, not only at the national level, but also at the political level. So in summary, I think the last few years, it's always tempting. There's always a piece that says we've reached peak populism and this is it. I certainly don't think the evidence points in that direction. I think these movements are here now for the foreseeable. I think we have to learn to live with them. I think they will be mirrored increasingly by their counterparts on the left that for different reasons will probably be less successful. But the big winner in all of this, I suspect, will just be ongoing political fragmentation. And we can perhaps take that into some discussion and some comments from it.
Wonderful. A lot to chew on, Matt. Thanks so much. Ed Luce.
Yes. Thank you, Josh. I should start by saying thank you for inviting me. This is just such a wonderful setting and such a nice break from normal life. Such good food. I know your co-author, Matt, is called Roger Eat Well. I think you should invite him as well next time because that's what we're doing here. Look, I didn't prepare sort of formal remarks because I wanted to respond to what you've just said, Matt, which was a very coherent, very, very interesting presentation. Thank you. I learned a lot from it. without being sort of pernickety, I think it's probably more useful, just for the framing here, if I respond to points on which I don't necessarily fully agree, or where I think you could flesh out more what you're arguing. But that doesn't mean to say I'm rejecting the whole of your book. It's a great book, and I think that was a great presentation. The first would be the sort of contingency of Brexit, because Brexit's sort of the biggest part of your example of populism. Of course, there are examples everywhere, and you cite them. But Brexit, it's where you live. It's what you know the best. It's where I first want to respond to you. There was a great headline. I don't know, the Americans here will know who Andy Borowitz is. Does that ring a bell to the non-Americans? The comic sketch writer at the New Yorker. And he, on the night of Brexit, tweeted this wonderful headline, comic sketch piece, when it became clear that Brexit was going to win. It was, "Brits lose long-cherished right to look down on Americans as dumber than they are." And I was reminded of that when you pointed out only 9% of academics, et cetera, it's probably only 9% of the FT, that there is a certain sneeringness, there is a certain sort of cultural snobbery about the Remain case that really got its nose bloodied, and I think you make that point very well. What I would say, though, is that I think we're all wise after the fact, and there was a real accidental contingency to Brexit. There was a real accidental quality to it. As you know, the polls in the years building up to Brexit had not shown the EU as being in the top 10 list of voters' concerns. A couple had, but consistently it wasn't showing up. The EU just wasn't a popular issue, let alone a populist issue. Immigration was. It went up, it went down as an issue. It wasn't always top. It was in the first 3 or 4. But EU just didn't feature. Then Cameron, for intra-Conservative Party reasons, not for national reasons, but to try and quieten the right wing, the Europhobic right wing, calls a referendum. But he calls a referendum 6 years into austerity, 6 years into really serious cuts to the basic services. People in post-industrial towns and in poorer parts of Britain are feeling most keenly. And essentially, the question is, do you want to leave Europe or not leave Europe? Most people don't know that much about Europe. They probably know a lot more now, and apparently, I think it's apocryphal, but the day after the most popular Google search was, what is the EU? It's like, what have we just done? And so essentially what Cameron was asking was, how are you guys feeling? Should we just continue the same way? A bit like Hillary Clinton's campaign slogan later that year. This was stronger together, let's carry on. I think what you're probably overlooking here is just the accidental quality of this. The contingency of Brexit is probably something that is now impossible to prove because it's so built into the political folklore now. And my family is mostly Remain, but I have a Brexit wing of the family, including my brother, who I just know not to talk, and he's probably saying the same thing about me, knows not to raise the issue because it's become like the royalists and the parliamentarians from the British Civil War. It's become so theological. But up until the day of Brexit, really, it wasn't an issue. And that's something I think that's worth pondering. We all look back on events as if they were serenely inevitable, but we didn't predict them before they happened. So that's one point. The second is a larger one, and I've written a book on this, and it's about the economic component, the economic driver of populism, which is often falsely contrasted to cultural reaction, as either populism is driven by economic woes or it's driven by cultural anxieties, as they're euphemistically called. Clearly it's both. Clearly to say it's one or the other is, I think, just a sort of it's a false choice. Clearly there's a sort of chemical interaction between people's frustration with their lives and their willingness to blame institutions, to lose trust in institutions, to scapegoat immigrants, whatever it might be, the particular populist manifestation. But I do think it's worth stressing that it's quite important over the previous 20, 25 years that as inequality rose in economies like Britain and the United States and France, and as income mobility declined, as that meritocratic escalator stopped working as well as it used to, particularly in America. I mean, there are lots of nuances between countries here. As median income stagnation really sort of took hold amongst those who'd only got a high school education, that you begin to see a rise in the political demand for scapegoating. And so I think, I mean, I call that the triple cocktail. Rising inequality, median income stagnation, and declining income mobility, which in America and in any sort of society which believes in meritocracy is probably the most important of that triple cocktail. All three had been declining. If you look at just to take America, which is the example I know best, so I tend to be more America-centric about this. If you take the median income, household income in 1978, by 2016 it was only 20% higher in real terms than in 1978. It should have been, if it had been rising at the same level it had been in the previous 3 decades since the war, it should have been more like 150% higher. So that's a big break. This wasn't your father's economy, it wasn't your grandfather's economy. It became you and your wife's economy, where your wife probably had, unlike in 1978 when she was stay at home, she's now got 3 part-time jobs. So the 20% rise actually is an exaggeration. You're feeling more time poor, more rushed, more stressed. Your job probably doesn't provide you good pension. It probably doesn't provide you the kind of health care your father's job did. And you probably can't afford to send your kids to college. So we all focus on the fact that since the 1980s, inflation was slain by Paul Volcker. And that's true of the basket of goods inflation. But if you look at healthcare and education inflation, they have been hyperinflationary in the last decade. So that the affordability of that sort of key bit on the meritocratic escalator gets put out of people's reach. And then, of course, you've got, which you mentioned quite rightly, and it's true in Britain as well, and in other countries, including France. You mentioned the opioid crisis. The deaths of despair is what Angus Date and Case, his co-author, have dubbed. The death of despair has led to, in the United States, it's so big that it's led to declining life expectancy for 3 consecutive years. Now, it is primarily a white working class problem, but there's been a recent Dayton Case paper, came out about 9 months ago, which is underappreciated, it hasn't been covered enough, that shows that's now spread to Hispanic and African American communities. We now have declining life expectancy for similar reasons amongst those ethnic groups as we have for a longer period of time amongst whites. That there is a crisis of employment, and there's a crisis of status associated with employment and the dignity of the kind of employment on offer, which I'll get to in a moment. So I suppose that's my first criticism. I think you understate the primacy, not primacy, the importance of the economic sort of piece of this. The culture bit is obviously hugely important as well. The reaction, as you call it, it's reactionary. It's for the most part not fascist. There are some fascist elements, though. I don't think we should deny that. There are, you can play both fields. And you look at Glenn Youngkin's campaign, he played the suburban mum, who mostly probably isn't racist, and he played the, he played the Daily Stormer. He played the whole field. So the point I want to make about culture is linked again to economics. If what drives this reactionary populism is, say, immigration, let's choose that as a popular explanation. Britain had obviously had a lot of immigration. America had a lot of immigration. Both countries were, I believe this, correct me if I'm wrong, 13% foreign-born in 2016 by sort of neat coincidence. This is 1 in 7 people. It was a recent peak. And therefore, this is a pretty good explanation as to people reacting against too much immigration too fast. I would say at a time of austerity, at a time where there is competition for scarce public resources and jobs that pay well. I'd say both matter. But let me sort of counterpoint that to other relatively comparable countries. Let me mention 3: Canada, Ireland, and Germany. Now, Ireland in 2016, and I believe it's now a point higher, 20% foreign-born, 20% foreign-born. And in spite of the 2008 crisis, it hasn't really had a populism. I mean, every country is sui generis, and there is a Tolstoyan element to this conversation. Each sort of populist country is uniquely unhappy in its own way. But Ireland bounced back very quickly from the 2008 crisis and its sort of property bubble, continued to welcome immigration, and the populist dog, for the most part, hasn't barked. Ireland is a particular example. It's the only country, I think, that you can think of where populism of the left variety and the right variety is all in one party, Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin is both the nationalist party and it's the sort of Marxian-influenced redistributionist party. But Irish culture has basically got a consensus. We don't really want to allow them access to office. So the highest Sinn Féin has got is considerably lower than populisms in many other countries. And I think the reason why the populist dog hasn't barked in Ireland is because middle-class incomes keep rising. There isn't that scarcity. There's a real sense of opportunity still in Ireland. It might not last, but the diaspora has been coming back. Some of them keep going out. There's a sort of circulation of the diaspora, but there's a globalist confidence to Ireland nowadays. Canada is another example. Canada hasn't had higher economic growth than the United States, but of course it's how growth is distributed is part of the aggregate number only tells you so much. Average income growth only tells you so much. What you want to look at is mean income growth. And the difference is best illustrated by that Mark Zuckerberg joke, which is Mark Zuckerberg walks into a bar and on average everybody's a billionaire. It's pretty useless. Averages don't tell you very much because probably most people in the bar earn less than 100,000. My favorite is on average Americans have 1.9 legs. It's pretty useless, right? The mean is what tells you what's happening. And mean income in America has been stagnating. And in Canada, even though aggregate growth has been a little bit lower, it's continued to rise. And partly that's because there's public support. There is socialized healthcare and that kind of thing. There is some protection against the ill winds of labor market transitions. And partly because it's quite a resource-based economy, and there was a commodities boom for quite a long time. That shielded it. But it's been a country of very high immigration, and for the most part, the populist dog there hasn't barked. And I would say that the relative economic comfort of the middle class is a part of the reason why. But the most interesting example, and this is the one I know least well, is Germany. But I think it's the most interesting example because Germany took in 1 million immigrants, and they weren't just sort of nearby immigrants. They were immigrants from the Middle East. They were immigrants of a different religion and a different ethnicity. And this was considered by Merkel to be a very reckless step, which would license right-wing populism to thrive in Germany. And what we've seen is it's sort of gradually been deflating. In the last election, the AfD got, I think, roughly double digits, right? Or maybe it was 9%. It was 10%, which was 2 or 3% lower than the previous election. Most of it in former East Germany. So if you have the percentage of former West Germany, we're more like 4%. It's much, much lower. Maybe it's 5, 6, but It's considerably lower. And again, you have to ask the question why. Well, former East Germany is the most economically blighted. It is the most post-industrial. It is the most hopeless in terms of your economic hopes for your children. And so I think that's got to be part of it. I'm sure there are lots of East-West sort of cultural resentments that go into that as well. But the fact is that Germany has been generating growth and distribution of growth. And to get to your dignity question, Matt, there's a lot of dignity in jobs that don't require college degrees in Germany, which I think is a very important piece of it. You can be a flower cutter in Germany, and you've done 2 years apprenticeship, and the skill and pride in that job is something quite remarkable. My wife's she's Irish, but she's a Germanophile, and whenever she orders sort of flowers in Germany, I'm listening, in admiration to the quality of her German, but also to the technical conversations about which flowers and what they do and which season. I mean, it's a pretty extraordinary dignity invested in things that we, in the more English-speaking democracies, tend not to invest. I think we make the mistake of thinking that if you have a college degree, you're skilled. And as somebody with a college degree, I know that's not true. So there is that point. I'm keeping my eye on the clock because I'm sort of responding. Then there is how we define populism. It's a word Josh was kind enough to mention that I read a book called The Retreat of Western Liberalism. I sort of deliberately use that slightly more specific language, although liberalism, of course, means different things each side of the Atlantic. Populism strikes me as a catch-all phrase that I'm a little bit uncomfortable with. I am more comfortable, though, slightly to contradict myself, with the term Pluto-populism. And this is my third and sort of final critique before I very quickly summarize where I agree with you strongly. And that is you don't emphasize, you very rightly point out that these are people who are less likely to be college educated, more likely to be working class, more likely to be economically bleak in their outlook, all very true. And that they're underrepresented in Parliament, absolutely correct, and in Congress, absolutely correct. If you look at that trajectory over the last generation, it's more and more college-dominated representative politics. But there is a tension there between the leaders of these populist movements, who are Oxbridge and Ivy League. They are Oxbridge and Ivy League. And the demotic they claim to be speaking for. And I think that tension, and I think the phrase Pluto-populism, which is something I think that was coined by my colleague Martin Wolf, is a really good lens to look at what is happening, whether you're looking at Orban, whether you're looking at Boris, whether you're looking at Trump. You're seeing people who talk culturally with the people, but who act in terms of redistribution and economic policies really quite differently. So, my more cynical days, I would call this a massive bait and switch. And you mentioned levelling up. It is a very good and smart political aim of Boris to aim for levelling up. Regional imbalance in Britain is worse than almost any other developed country, and the resentment is thus very understandable. But Rishi Sunak has just produced a budget that could have been produced by George Osborne. It's right, we're going to cut borrowing, we're going to balance our books again, we're going to move back to the old sort of Thatcher housewife, balances her books kind of language. That's Sunak's. So we hear about levelling up, but watch what they do, not what they say, is I guess the sort of core Pluto-populist point. And the other point you make about meritocracy, which I think is a very good one. Meritocracy is intuitively something we all support. It is more formally the creed of America, I think, but it has become informally, as we've all modernized, the creed of places like Britain, since Thatcher, Blair, etc., and most democracies. It's become quite natural for people to say equality of opportunity, not of outcome. So it's not the creed per se that people have a problem with. It's the degree to which it's rigged. So I saw a study that came out the other day that said that 43% of people at Harvard are white who are either there because they're legacy students, one of their parents went there, they're dean's choice, so there is, basically academics, nephews and stuff, athletics, and I forget what the fourth category is. Either David or Jeff will probably know, or you might know. Yes, donors, you're quite right, so the most obvious one. And of those 43%, 3/4 would not get in on their academics alone. So clearly this game, when people say it's rigged, when Elizabeth Warren says it, or when Josh Hawley says it, it's true, and it resonates with people. The question is what the populists are doing about it. And I think that when populists own power for long enough, the contradictions between how they're actually governing and what they said to get there will push them more and more into cultural politics to make up for it. That there is a sort of, there is a logic that pushes them into more and more extreme cultural division to divert from what they're doing with governing. I don't know whether Boris Johnson's going to invoke Article 16, which, for those of you who don't know, it's the protocol negotiated for the withdrawal agreement of Brexit. But if he does, that's a pretty dramatic step. I think you'd agree, right, Matt? Mm. That's a pretty dramatic step in which he's basically sort of declaring a much larger game of chicken with Europe, in which Ireland is in the middle and the Irish border is in the middle. I think if you look at where the Republicans are going culturally, and I was talking to David last night about this conservatism conference that he was just at. You have Josh Hawley saying because men are being insulted, they're all turning to pornography, this kind of stuff. You have J.D. Vance, who was originally very eloquent with his hillbilly elegy on this whole subject of the white working class and how they're the least sympathized with category, which I think you're absolutely right about. He's now saying we should kill all professors. I mean, he made it because he got to Yale. So I think the logic to push to more cultural extremism is inherent within populism and will therefore lead to it morphing much more rapidly than I think you give credit for. I think you describe it as a coherent and potentially stable force in a very fragmented, fluid political environment. I think it's a far more dynamic force that I think that has to keep doubling its bets to get elected. And I'm going to finish on this point, which is with the United States. That really deeply worries me, because it has to involve race. If you look at the breakdown in income groups who voted for Biden and who voted for Trump in 2020, it's often cited that 54% of Americans who own over 100,000, earn over 100,000 a year, voted for Trump, and 57% who earn under 50,000 a year voted for Biden. And therefore, this is taken as a very sort of conclusive piece of evidence that the idea that the poor are with Trump is quite wrong. Trump is a sort of a rich person's game. I think that completely misreads the numbers within the numbers. If you look at those 57% who voted for Biden, who earn under 50,000, and you break it down by race, then it becomes very clear. The majority of whites who earn under 50,000 voted for Trump. And the majority of non-whites voted for Biden. And if you look at those same numbers for Bill Clinton, the overwhelming majority of whites voted for Clinton. So you have seen a big migration of poor whites, of the poor working class, the blue-collar white, to the right. And you've seen pretty much a stable showing amongst non-whites. They were already very democratic, particularly African Americans. That logic's going to get doubled down on, and that really does worry me. We're sitting here, I think this is sort of a wonderful place, Cap Ferrat, to talk about populism. But we are a few miles from Nice, you know, which, as French friends here can tell you better than I, was one of the early strongholds of Le Pen père and daughter and great niece, etc. And the juxtaposition, you know, as I think is thought-provoking. But if you look across the parts of the West that are suffering worst from populism, I think what you see in each country is very particular manifestations of populism. You know, I mean, Britain leaving the EU was very sui generis to Britain. You know, Britain's populism is very globalist. Boris promises trade deals with everybody. Nobody in American politics is promising trade deals with anybody, whether they're populist or not populist. So the causes, I think, the manifestations are sui generis. But I think the causes, at least in the Western European and the United States countries, the one thing we do have in common is we have had a real middle-class squeeze. And it's been going along for 30 years, and trust in public institutions pretty broadly across the spectrum has been declining, and optimism about your children's future has been going down with it. And I think you cannot leave economics out of that explanation, even though culture is a huge part of it. But overall, I found your talk, you know, I'm just picking on things I disagree with.
Well, thanks to you both. There are a couple ways to do this. We could obviously have Matt now respond, and I think instead of that, let me suggest that we just use the next hour to have adult learning. If you want to grab a coffee as we're having the conversation, you're welcome to do so. But let's not formally break. We will break at 4 o'clock for a real break, and then 6 o'clock a reception, and 7 o'clock dinner, similar to last night. So let me just turn it right over to you, if there's one to start us off. Phil Rucker from the Washington Post. Yeah. And Phil, if you wouldn't mind hitting that mic.
Matt, your presentation was really insightful, so thank you for that. I want to ask a question specific to the United States, and it's, do you see the rise in national populism as inevitable in the United States, or does it require a cult of personality, a figure like a Donald Trump with charisma, with rhetoric, with an ability to communicate culturally to the masses, for lack of a better term, and draw them in? Or is this sort of an inevitable kind of evolution in our political system in the United States based on the other data points that you mentioned?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And if I could thank Ed as well for the very insightful and thought-provoking comments. And perhaps the way to do this, perhaps if we can also chat later on as well between us about some things. I'm always wary of the fact that now, if you put two Brits in a room, they always talk about Brexit. And some of you may not share our deep level obsession with the Brexit wars. But if you do, of course, I can talk about Brexit all day. And as much I agree with what you said. I don't think it's inevitable, no. But I think if you look at the political science evidence on what's happening in party systems across the West, whether it's, you know, if Pippa were here, I suspect she'd say the same. David Shaw and colleagues in Europe, they're all essentially saying the same thing right now, that we have polarization by values, which is being compounded by generation and education, and which in turn is being compounded by geography. So it takes different forms in different countries, but you know, if I look at the US and the UK now, I see remarkable similarities, and the way in which structurally the centre-left is really now running into big problems. Think about how hard it is going to be for the Democrats over the next 10 years to win presidential elections. It is going to be very difficult. They will need, I think I'm right in saying, at least 53% of the popular vote, maybe more, because of the biases within the system. If the Labour discussed. So I think, obviously the leadership is part of that story. The thing about the US, for me, in populism is, populism is kind of part of the fabric of the United States. We started the book with the People's Party, a kind of quintessential populist party in the late 19th century, and Huey Long and Father Coughlin and Richard Hofstadter's paranoid style, and in many ways the US has been historically one of the great incubators of populism in different forms. Very charismatic leaders that are able to, in different ways, step outside of the mainstream consensus. I don't think it's inevitable that any country will go populist. All I'm merely pointing out is that if we look at the evidence seriously, objectively, and we just try and put hopes and aspirations and ideology and so on to one side, I just think this movement is likely to remain as a fairly permanent feature now on the political landscape. And Ed has alluded to many of the reasons why, and I completely agree with him. The only issue, if I can just use my position, just one thing I'll push back on was the levelling up point, because I think it's important. The budget we just saw in the UK was symbolic of a very different brand of conservatism, in my view, from what we saw with Thatcher. Biggest expansion of the state for 40-odd years, huge increases in spending on health, education, less so, but public services. A Conservative Party that's now at least claiming that it's going to be the party of the National Health Service, in the way that Tony Blair once said he was going to be the party of law and order. 4 billion on levelling up communities, National Infrastructure Bank in the north of England, civil servants getting told to leave London and move further north. Some of this stuff is more symbolic than substantive, I accept that point. But I think this brand of conservatism, which I've tried to argue is really encapsulated by leaning a little bit left on the economy and a little bit right on culture, is essentially Johnson's strategy. And, for Blair, the formula was essentially economic liberalism and social liberalism. And for the era of Cool Britannia in the 2000s, that worked really well. And Bill Clinton, in different ways, did his own version of that. But I think the formula today is a very different one, and it is reaching voters who do feel, I completely accept Ed's argument, the system is rigged. The few are moving away from the many. But at the same time, the culture issues are very real, very pressing, and I think are being exacerbated by the rise of radical progressives. And I really do think the evidence on this is overwhelming. Let's go back to the audience, but I'll leave you with one stat. How big is the woke group in the US and UK? Because I'm often told that this woke stuff is a distraction, and actually it's a very fringe issue, and you're sort of starting a culture war by talking about it. If you look at a recent study by More in Common, which is a very reasonable, sensible civil society group, they estimate in the UK it's 13%. If you look at a study by King's College London, they estimate the group is now growing to about 23%. Obsessed with racism, consumed by historic injustices, deeply ashamed of Britain, its history, and I'm using Britain as an example, but we can talk about the US, we can talk about Canada, we can talk about wherever else. Deeply ashamed of the country, do not actively identify with the national community, and I think in some ways openly disdainful, as Zach Goldberg in the US has shown, of people within their own community. Elite graduate levels in the US being more positive, even in fact moving further to the left on issues of culture, race and racism than the average African American. White graduate liberals moving so far left that they're more concerned about these issues than the minority voters, and also openly disliking low-income white working class voters. That is a recipe for political polarization. That is disastrous, in my view, unless somebody stands up and says, actually, this wokeism stuff is bonkers, which thankfully people are starting to do it, and that's why I think the universities are on the front line of this. Yeah.
Great. So just to name it, we've got 9, now 10 questions on deck. Let's go next to Bishop Zach. And if you wouldn't mind, I apologize for our mic inability. Maybe you could just take Jeff's chair for a moment, or as you see fit. Bishop Zach from Uganda.
Thank you very much. Very insights, listening to a cross-Atlantic conversation, both on the whole anti-Jewish, anti-Semitism, and so on, and this about populism. Coming from the continent of Africa, more specifically south of the Sahara, north of Southern Africa, South Africa. Really, really curious about the question of race and how that plays in this conversation, and the whiteness and white superiority and how that plays into all this. But secondly, the place of violence. I'm very curious to hear from you, Matt, what you think, how Trump found friends who had been in power for many years, but found in Trump a justification for their continued repressive methods and ways of their societies. And I can give examples if you want me to. Museveni of Uganda. I can go to several others in French-speaking Africa. I have friends of mine in Latin America who tell me of a similar trend, or South Asia. Hence the whole connection with fascism, repression, and a populism indeed, of the features you've described, but that has spurred, for example, the story of Uganda. Education and healthcare are much worse than they have ever been, and yet appealing to populist sentiments, and the whole idea of fear as a factor that seems to drive this, which of course military dictators such as Museveni or Kagame or others in other places use fear as part of this whole populist type movement. So I'd be interested to hear your comments about this because in spite of everything else you've said, that's a reflection of why this is the case. One can look at different numbers, and yet the ride on populism, really amazing how you have more Trump-type leaders that predated even his time, who had been in power for so many years, military generals turned politicians and so on and so forth, justifying their continued stay in power, repressive regimes, but actually appealing to this populist sentiment that is, of course, in my view, a facade. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the very insightful question. I'll say openly I'm not an expert on Africa and African politics, so I'll limit my comments to Europe, North America. As an aside, a colleague of mine, Nick Cheeseman, at Birmingham, is doing a lot of work regarding populism and party politics in Africa, and it may be just useful in terms of exploring some of his work as well. In terms of race, but my view, especially with regard to Western Europe, I'll come to America in a minute, especially with regard to the UK, levels of racial prejudice are currently at their lowest level on record, as we would measure racism. If we use questions like social distance questions, would you feel comfortable with one of your relatives marrying somebody from another group, somebody who's Asian, West African, Muslim? if you were to look over the last half century and you were to take the social science evidence at face value, you would conclude things have been getting a lot better, not a lot worse. I'm heartened by the finding last month that the proportion, so the percentage of people in my country who now say you no longer need to be white to be British is 93%. So clearly there is a group, a sort of hardcore group that still views their national identity mainly through the prism of race. I do think the overall story has been very positive, and I am slightly anxious about our inability to talk about the positive trends as well. Levels of hate crime, with, I think I'm right in saying, the exception of a sort of spike in 2017, have remained fairly low, but it's difficult to really interrogate that because we've only started collecting hate crime data in a serious way in recent years. So we're not entirely sure, is it because there's hate crime, or is it because people are conscious of hate crime and are now reporting it more seriously than they once did. But I fully take on board your point about the legitimization of violence. And I think that's working at both ends of the spectrum. That's probably why we're here having this conversation, because when I've sat in the UK over the last 18 months looking at America, I've been quite shocked at the level of violence that has now seemed to be not acceptable, but has become an everyday feature of American life, and seems to be something that we now assume is just part of the American experience, whether that's far left protesters, Antifa, whether that's murder and white supremacism on the right, or terrorism. So I fully take on board that point. Maybe one way forward, however, would be to, and I'm sort of conscious I'm in a room full of journalists, is to put the question back to the room and just ask, ponder why we seem so unable to point to some of the positive trends that are taking place in many Western societies. Because there are a lot of positive things happening. Look at the attitudes of my Zoom students. They are a world away from the attitudes of my grandparents. Yet we seem unable to communicate that. The dominant narrative appears to be that Western societies are disintegrating, are deteriorating rapidly, and that racism is increasing. The social science evidence, I think, doesn't support that. I'm happy for people to disagree with me, but I think we have a strained relationship going on that perhaps might be one that the journalists in the room want to reflect on.
Aren't your Zoom students the very students that are promoting this culture war that you were, the cancel culture that you were talking about earlier?
Some of them are. I think what you find with the progressives is that, I mean, my experience on campus at least is, the Cambridge vote actually was very revealing recently. A good friend of mine, Arif Ahmed, asked professors at Cambridge, will you sign publicly a petition to oppose an attempt to limit freedom of speech on campus, and he couldn't get 24 signatures. That vote was subsequently held under secret ballot, and about 85% of professors opposed the move to limit freedom of speech because they no longer feared the consequences of what would happen if their names were publicly associated with that. The point that I'm making is that the extremes and the radicals represent somewhere in the region of 10, 15%, maybe 20%, but are certainly nowhere near a majority. But the narrative that nonetheless dominates and is often pushed by many people with good intentions who want to make the world a better place, the narrative that is pushed is actually, I think, deeply destructive, which is that everything is getting worse. Kenan Malik at The Guardian wrote a very good column on this liberal left voices to catastrophize. And so we are sort of sliding into this overtly pessimistic story about who we are, when I look at the survey evidence, and my argument would be Britain has never been as open, tolerant and welcoming as it is today. And we either believe in empirical evidence or we don't. So I'll leave it there.
For your next answer will be even more clear, which is great. So Emma, can you carry on? We've got, by the way, 9 of us. It's Emma, Tucker, Simon Cooper, Carolina, Mattia, Katrin Benhold, Thomas Chatterton-Williams, Vincent, and Anne Elizabeth. So you're on. Yes. And Shaddy, an advisor.
I'd love to hear Ed's views.
Yeah, and you may have thoughts on this too. Let's just try to maximize as best we can.
Tell us who's not talking.
Yeah,
Just
right.
quick, it's quicker.
So I was first of all curious to know, Matt, whether you agree with Ed's diagnosis around where he mentioned the 3 countries, Ireland, Canada and Germany, whether you agree that they've bucked the trend because the incomes of middle classes have been rising, median incomes. And also, on this issue of, you sort of paint a picture of populism being here to stay. But over time, okay, maybe that's true, but what will the battleground be? Because if you're a populist party, you come in with a mission. But over time, you know, how do you keep that going? Will it just be that electorates become one populist party, or elections become one populist party versus another populist party? I'm just curious to know what the battleground will be, because each of the populist movements that we've talked about have had a very specific motive. So in Britain, it was Brexit. In France, it's been, you know, anti-immigration. But what happens? I mean, what happens when they've sort of dealt with that? We've dealt with Brexit now. So what will be the battleground for populism in Britain, for example?
Yeah, so to keep my response as short as possible, my response to Ed would be that, I agree on the role that inequality plays, that it's a central backdrop factor. We've got a chapter on the economic factors in the book. The examples he raises are very interesting ones. I'm shaped by my experience of having looked at this in different ways from the late 90s. So I sometimes go back into how would that version of me look at the landscape today. When I was in Austria in the late 90s, some of you will remember the big story was Jörg Haider and the Freedom Party. And this was the really big moment, the first moment actually that Europe was shocked by sort of populism, far-right politics. 2002, Le Pen reached the final against Chirac, the second round, and of course that was also then a big moment. And then we had Pim Fortuyn in the Netherlands and Geert Wilders. So, you know, when you actually look back and you just trace it, it's always been there. It's just come in different forms, different ways. But I would never actually at that point have expected Germany to have a viable, I wouldn't even say the AfD is national populist. I think the AfD is more an extreme right-wing party. I'm looking at someone with a more intimate understanding of it than I. I would never have thought Germany would have had that many seats in the Bundestag when I was looking at it in the late 90s. That to me would have been profoundly shocking in the way that Sweden, having the Sweden Democrats, Portugal now having a party, Spain having Vox, and these are not actually soft populist parties. These are very hardcore movements. And I think that's just a reminder that when we look at this through the longer lens, or sort of wider lens, and look at over the longer term, actually the tectonic plates are moving continuously and are opening up democracies that historically didn't really have these movements to begin with. And on the economic point, the reason I don't put all my chips into that bag is look at Switzerland. Very prosperous, very affluent, high quality of life. Swiss People's Party has been a very durable, present political party that has really mobilized many of the same issues, many of the same themes. Levels of inequality in relative terms are very low in countries that have also seen these movements break through. Sweden, Netherlands being 2 examples, Austria being another one, historically fairly low levels of inequality compared to some of their counterparts, but have nonetheless seen these movements break through. And it's because immigration and demographic change is in my view, a much more potent driver of support for these movements. And so when I look ahead, you know, you look at, say, the Pew Research Center, very reliable, rigorous, independent agency, and looking at how European societies are going to evolve over the next 20, 30, 40 years, and some of the debates that is going to cause, I don't think we've really begun to have those debates. To give you one example, the capacity of Islam, particular types of Muslim communities within Europe, it's a very different experience from America, to adapt to essentially, you know, Western values on same-sex rights, women's rights, you know, all of those issues. We haven't really begun to get into it. We've touched around it, around schools in Birmingham and those kinds of issues, but we've not really got into those kinds of debates. And in the same way, I was unfortunately not able to hear the talk this morning, but I imagine around the conversation to do with Zamor, there was a discussion of segregation and cultural distance between groups within French society, and I don't see, I'm less optimistic than Ed, I don't see a country in Europe currently that has really come up with a really rigorous approach to integration that appears to work. Maybe the jury's out, maybe Germany will do that. Let's see what happens over the next 10 years. Maybe Denmark is another route where it's a much more hands-on, assertive, some might say hard-line approach to integration, where communities are almost forced to live together and to integrate, and children at schools are forced to attend schools where there is a good balance between different groups. You know, these are the sorts of things that I think we're going to end up actually talking about increasingly as we go forward. Again, Ed Hussein's book, I just want to say, is brilliant on this. You know, talking about the experience of young British Muslim children essentially going through their lives, never interacting with somebody from outside of that community, at school, you know, at the mosque, their evenings, their weekends, and that, I suspect, will give these movements, it will be ugly, but it will give these movements ongoing potential. And on the other side, the narratives about who we are, because most people do not want to live in countries where they are told over and over again that they are white supremacists, racists, and they should feel bad about their national community. And I think we need to somehow carve out a much more balanced narrative.
Want to weigh on this too?
Yeah, I just very quickly want to say, I don't want to give the impression, I think, as you put it, Matt, that all my chips are in the economic basket. What I was trying to do is sort of counterbalance that this is all a cultural thing. And I think with Germany and Ireland in particular, that there's a civic education system there. There's a national culture that is aware of the risks of playing with fire in your politics that I don't think in most of the English-speaking world, particularly Britain and America, that we have. I think we've got no memory of being occupied or losing a war or revolution, and I think in Ireland, they're aware politics comes with, you know, can sometimes come with bullets, and in Germany, for reasons I don't need to elaborate, there is a deep fear of populism, except in East Germany, which hasn't had the same civic education system for most of, well, until it reunified with Germany. And of course, Austria sees itself as a victim of Nazi Germany rather than a co-conspirator. So, for sure, this is bigger than just economics. And I think national narratives and national culture and how we think about who we are and all the range of possibilities available as to who we decide we are and what limits there are to it is a hugely important piece of this, in addition to the economics.
Let's turn next to Mattia Ferrarisi from Domani in Rome.
Thank you so much for this presentation and this great discussion. I was wondering if you can get a little bit more into the economic versus values type of dichotomy that Edward was suggesting as sort of a false analogy or a false choice, sorry. I'm wondering, though, if there's a broader thing. I do think I'm more on Matthew's side of the argument here, specifically on this case, but I don't want to downplay the role of economic. But at the same time, I wonder what you think, whether we are seeing, broadly speaking, in the last 30 or 40 years, like a paradigm shift in terms of like what economic means for like the meaning of life of people. Meaning, if we are moving from a sort of is the economy stupid paradigm in which economy is the all-encompassing and definitive measure of every aspect of life, to something different. I'm thinking a lot about, for example, just to give you a hint, what, for example, colleagues like Derek Thompson at The Atlantic is doing about the way he's reading, sort of interpreting the Great Resignation, not just in terms of a phenomenon that is happening prompted by the emergency of the pandemic, but also like a way of rediscussing the role of work and so success and then making money in people's life in general. I'm wondering if you read also, like, especially Matthew, since you're insisting on values as sort of the pillar of the populist movement in general, if you see that paradigm shift in terms of the way, the role we give to the economy in life. But also, I'm interested in, Edward, since you have a more critical perspective on this and a different one.
I don't want to get drawn, like Edward, I don't want to get drawn into economic culture. I think we've been having that debate for a while. The one thing I would say about the nature of the economy and how we talk about it, the reason we put an emphasis on relative deprivation as opposed to objective deprivation is that it's very clear many of the people who have been leaving the mainstream are in jobs, are sometimes earning fairly decent money. The big group, for example, that voted for somebody like Nigel Farage or Marine Le Pen is the C2, skilled workers, mechanics, plumbers, factory workers, sandwiched between more affluent middle class, more affluent professionals on one hand and unskilled workers and folks on welfare on the other. But if I throw all the economic variables I can find into a model, they'll tell me nothing about why they're voting for populism. It will come down to their attitudes around migration, which of course are partly shaped by their position within the economy and society, but it is ultimately their attitudes around migration and also their very, very strong dissatisfaction with the current settlement, which is giving them basically no voice. And those will just take me much, much further than anything around income or how they feel about inequality or so on. Most of those voters, by the way, are very aspirational. They are what Margaret Thatcher called Mondeo man, or who we might today call the Greggs guys. So the Brits will know what I mean by that. But Greggs is a very, it's a wonderful shop. It's very sort of low priced. I don't know how you describe Greggs. Low price pastries, I guess. And very, very on board. They were the most supportive of Brexit, most supportive of Boris Johnson in the same way that group is fundamental to Le Pen. Work hard, big emphasis on fair play, very patriotic, very attached to the group, but they don't live their lives thinking about GDP. Think about family and identity, community, and ways of life, and the things that Bobby Kennedy talked about a long time ago that we don't really put into how we talk about GDP. I'm not sure that's answering your question, but we can pick it up later on.
I'm happy to pick up now or later, but okay, very briefly. Yeah, I mean, you're right. We've gone from it's the economy stupid to it's the culture stupid as the sort of more of the organizing principle of politics. I do think the left, it was Clinton who coined, well, it was James Carville who coined that phrase, but I do think the left, changed quite dramatically and sacrificed the blue collar, the working class vote by embracing the third way, essentially becoming Davos, the party of Davos. And it's not just in Britain and France. Jospin here. I mean, in Italy, you had third way left, reconstituted left. And I think that when the 2008 crisis hit, and certainly in countries like Britain, the elites. I mean, Blair was associated with big finance, with globalization, with trade. The working classes felt the left didn't really speak for them, and so they lost them to culture. and it became a culture war. But that doesn't mean to say economics isn't a massively important part of this explanation.
So can I suggest that we go to this corner of the room and maybe take a pair of questions and stack them if we can, with Katrin Benhold from New York Times and Shadi Hamid from Brookings, one after the other, if you don't mind.
So I'm really interested in how you guys think the pandemic might be reshuffling politics, because I think there's actually a lot we don't know yet. And what I observed in the recent German election, which I covered, and where a social democrat came out on top, is that not only did the SPD, who at 25% didn't, or 26% didn't exactly sort of get a landslide, but did come out on top. They didn't just win voters, Merkel voters from the Conservatives, but half of the voters they won were actually working class voters who they'd left previously to the AfD and the Left Party. So there's something in that message of respect, which was the main slogan of the campaign, that seems to have resonated. And one possible explanation of why the Social Democrats in Germany are paying more attention to it, apart from the fact that apparently Olaf Scholz has read Michael Sandel's latest book and did a little debate with him last December, so there's actually a connection there, is that after 2008, everybody thought, well, not only did it bring to light how the Social Democrats had kind of like left behind their working class constituency, but it also was a moment when people thought, well, maybe now we can win them back. Now is the moment. And Obama was elected, and there was a little bit of a sense that maybe the SPD would, come back and so on. But it didn't happen. But when the pandemic hit, you sort of now have a second crisis. The first one was the crisis that showed us that, big finance is basically getting richer on the back of everybody else, and then has to be bailed out by taxpayers' money. The pandemic showed that the people who are most vital and important in our societies are vastly undervalued. And I think that sort of realization is still being digested, is my sense, certainly in Germany, but from what I'm hearing from British colleagues in Britain too, that realization, that these two crises together might actually change politics. And I'm just wondering whether you think that there is room for social democrats to challenge those national populists. For a long time, we thought that it would be conservatives who would be best placed, maybe because of the cultural element. But conservatism is in a deep crisis, except in the two countries where basically the conservatives have been co-opted by the national populists. So, Britain and the US. So I'm just wondering whether you're seeing evidence, or whether you believe that the chips might be reshuffled, and that actually social democracy may be at a moment where it has a realistic chance of winning against the national populists.
Shadi, can that pair with your question? Maybe not, but we'll do our best.
Yeah, sure. So when I listen to a conversation like this, I'm reminded of what living in the Middle East was like in the Arab Spring, where all politics was basically cultural identity and religion-based, even though obviously economic issues for the average person were terrible. And if you asked an ordinary person, what you really care about, they'd probably say unemployment, poverty, or whatever. But I have actually very, very little recollection of ever hearing an economics-based debate on the national level in Egypt or Tunisia during that period. And in some ways at that time, I thought that was unique, and I thought America and Europe were different. But what's interesting is that essentially we're having, it's different in certain ways, but politics is existential in Western democracies now in a way that very much reminds me of the Middle East, which raises the question if that is sort of the natural state of politics, and what we saw where left-right economic policy issues that seemed like you could split the middle on them, that was an aberration, and now we're sort of returning to the norm of what politics really is at some fundamental level. Because if populist parties continue being as significant as they have been in recent years, it just raises the existential tenor of politics. Every election feels more weighty. It feels like something fundamental is at stake, because something fundamental is at stake. So my worry there is that it will have profound effects on democratic stability, because if you see the other side winning as being personally threatening, you're going to be less enthusiastic about respecting democratic outcomes. I mean, maybe in places like Germany and elsewhere in Europe where you have parliamentary systems that can lower the temperature, but where it's more winner takes all, like in the US, I mean, I really do worry about what will happen if Trump wins in 2024 and what that leads to in terms of a loss of faith in the democratic idea, where it's like, well, if Trump won twice, then do we really believe in democracy? So I'm just curious how you would reflect if you kind of take the analysis to the implications of democracy. Can we live indefinitely with existential politics, one election after the other, where it's not just the policies that are at stake, but the who we are questions? Because we don't really agree on who we are anymore, and that's fundamentally what we're talking about here. In the US or in France or in Germany, what's at stake is what it means to be German. What is German identity? What is the American idea? And those are very difficult to resolve through normal democratic politics, because it's hard to split the middle on them. So even if it is stable, as you're saying, Matt, that these parties will be around, for the foreseeable future, I mean, that has implications because populist parties provoke very strong reactions on the other side, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly. And I think there's many people in these countries who aren't willing to live with results if the results keep on producing populist victories. And that's a problem I'm not to say that I'm an anti-populist, but for those of us who don't vote for populist parties, we're not very good at respecting the legitimacy of populist outcomes or populist parties winning.
Yeah.
I'm happy either way.
I'll keep it very brief. There's some really great questions. On the first, everything is cyclical. I think social democracy potentially at some point can reinvent itself. I don't think my personal reading of Germany is it's still very, very early days, and that's a little bit of tentative evidence to suggest if you get the Greens doing well and you get the SPD doing well, and maybe you can cobble together a sort of social democratic coalition. But I mean, I still think the crisis of social democracy is alive and well, and was also partly revealed and is being revealed at the moment in the United States. There doesn't seem to be an ideological answer to that question. There might not need to be an ideological answer, maybe, but I haven't seen many convincing diagnoses on the left about how they can put together a durable, stable, long-term coalition, given, as Shadi said, that it's the who we are questions that are breaking off the Hampsteads from the Hartlepools. It really is. But in the sake of time, let's discuss that a little bit more later on. And I agree with you about the intensity of polarization and culture wars. And I look at the US from London, and I think it's going rapidly in the wrong direction. I'm a statement of the obvious, but I was struck when we had an event with John Haidt, who was talking about the scale of the disagreement on the moral questions now is phenomenal, and was quite skeptical about whether over the longer term the US can hold that, the centre can hold. And I won't pretend to have an answer to it. I would just issue a plea that there's two sides in this, right? And one of the things that we've seen since Trump is, I use the word cautiously, but is the radicalization of white graduate progressives who have done a 180 since 2016. I mean, look at the David Rosado, who I'm working with at the moment in New Zealand, who did the work really on this, with Zach Goldberg. I mean, the attitudinal shift has been remarkable, the doubling down on a sort of extreme liberalism. And then on the other hand, the kind of, crazy conspiracy, Trumpers on the right. And I just would urge us not to view that polarization through one lens. There's two reactions going on here, and everybody has a responsibility to speak to that. And unfortunately, it's only one group that dominates almost all of the institutions, and ultimately shapes that narrative about who we are and how we respond to groups. And it's one of those groups that has an enormous amount of political and economic and cultural power. And that's not a fashionable thing to say. I mean, if you spend any time on Twitter, you'll see the debates that academics have and the general criticism that is thrown in my direction, among others. But there are two sides to this discussion, and we need to somehow carve out more space. It's a difficult thing to do, but we do need to carve out some more space for the other side to have and enter this conversation about who we are.
Can we try the same thing with two additional first-time participants at Faith Angle, Thomas Chatterton-Williams and Carolina Ligera? Can you guys each throw one of these?
Sure. I'll be pretty quick, and thank you both for your comments. I'm fascinated in a variety of facets of your remarks, but just because you used the term wokeness several times, I was wondering how you would define wokeness concretely and concisely. Personally, I'll put my cards on the table. I'm highly critical of what falls under the umbrella of wokeness, but I think the term is no longer useful. I've thought that for a while now, but I was recently at a conference with Alan Finkielkraut at the Tocqueville Chateau, and the entire time he just kept talking about le wokisme, and I realized that this word will never persuade anybody who doesn't already start with the same premises.
Fair enough, yeah.
And then I want to, after you define wokeness, I'm just wondering, how can we counter it within the tradition of liberalism and not through reactionary populist politics, which I have no sympathy for either?
And Carolina?
Yeah. First, thank you so much for this delightful panel, and also I congratulate you on your books, which are both very, very good. Now, to touch a little bit on the Matt's question about how it is possible that the West is so critical about itself and its achievements, one of the hypotheses might be that simply there is today what wasn't a couple of years ago, or perhaps 3 decades ago, an alternative or alternatives that proved to be successful. So Putin's Russia and China. So there are political regimes that are not at all liberal and democratic, but they are doing well. And they do not need the Western values for this. So if we are asking whether this is economy stupid or cultural stupid, then it's economy and culture stupid. So this is first very brief remark. Now, another thing, I have been listening and thinking that we are trying to give a coherent answer for the reasons for which populism is gaining attention and voters. But in fact, populism isn't coherent at all. And we should perhaps stress the fact that the reasons that brought the populists to power in my country, but also in many other countries, are not the reasons that are keeping them at power. And this is very important to stress. So I would like to throw three more stones into this discussion and ask you what you think about it. Like, for example, you never mentioned the rule of law. But it seems that the rule of law and deterioration and anarchization of the rule of law in countries where populists are already at power serves some role. It plays some role in keeping their popularity. Perhaps it's connected with the fact that the rule of law is associated in their utterances, in their ideology, with this suspicion towards elites, the evil elite, and their paragraphs. Yes? So this is the first thing. The second thing, I think, populist statement. This is a term that we coined with Jarosław Kuisz together. So populist statement is something that is another chain of development after infotainment and politainment. Namely, that populists also serve as a kind of perverted entertainment. They don't have to make us amused, but they keep our attention, and they keep attention of voters, and they use social media very, very skillfully. So this is another thing I would like you to comment on, and perhaps it also connects with your question about how to respond without losing the liberal identity here. And the third thing is, I deeply agree with Matt that that national populism, in comparison to fascism, is much more nostalgic. Yes, there is a lot of the feeling of loss here and managing the feeling of loss. But if it weren't also a concept of modernization, an alternative modernization, it wouldn't perhaps be so effective. Like, for example, in my country, the national populists basically decided to step off the way to westernize ourselves, and they got back to the idea of the Second Republic of Poland, which was isolationist and quite authoritarian. And also it has this sovereignism, which was the idea of its modernization. But it's not only going back, it's actually also creating an idea of how another path of modernization might look like.
Wonderful questions. The first question, yeah, I mean, I use woke just because in the context of this room, everybody knows what I mean. I would define left modernism is what I would call it technically. I'm writing a book at the moment on the history of wokeism, which is, sorry, left modernism. But I'm using shorthands. I would define it along the lines of it being the sacralization of racial, sexual, and gender minorities, essentially.
The sacralization.
Yeah, minorities are viewed as sacred in almost a religious sense, that cannot be, that becomes the prism through which society is essentially viewed, and you cannot challenge, question, interrogate those claims, and that view of politics dominates really over the more unifying common humanity approaches that we had in the 60s and the 70s. I mean, if you look at how the civil rights movement has evolved in the UK, as well as actually the US, you know, the campaigners that we have today think about minority-majority relations in a very different way than they once did. But I can talk a bit more. Perhaps later on we could have a conversation
That's an excellent response.
about it.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
That was an excellent
Clean.
concise
Yeah.
way of describing it that you don't often hear in the conversation, actually.
Well, thanks for let's chat some more hopefully later on. Secondly, I completely agree. I mean, I've read a fascinating blog on the way here this morning. Actually, the LSE blog has just run something on law and justice, on how they perceive the rule of law issue and how they perceive the judiciary essentially as still being filled with the old elite that sort of, you know, was a hangover essentially from the era of communism that is sought to block their particular return to you know, sort of Greater Poland and so on. And I take your point. How they stay in power is often different from how they get into power. This book, which I forgot to mention, there are 3 free copies for anybody who would like one, alongside my mother. You two can read the book. Is more interested in how they rise, not necessarily how they stay. But the question you ask is one that I think we're going to debate. To go back to Emma's point, is one we're going to debate over the next few years, which is what does post-populism look like, right? When they've broken through, what does that era look like? What happens if they don't bring the jobs back to the Rust Belt? What happens if Boris Johnson doesn't revive the Red Wall? What happens if Zemmour, God forbid, were he to win the presidency, if he doesn't deliver this pseudo-fascist society? What if Salvini, etc., doesn't, you know, take a lot harder line with Europe? I think the jury's out. My instinct is, to be honest, their voters won't care. My gut instinct is because they are so animated by having somebody at the table that doesn't always look and sound like them, to go back to Edward's point about Pluto populism, but at least claims to speak for them, may well be greater than the transactional cost-benefit analysis that we often assume drives voters. I mean, look at Johnson. I mean, he isn't a classic national populist, but he's barely fallen below 40%. In fact, today was only the second occasion in the polls for nearly 200 polls where he slipped behind Labour and not even outside the margin of error. And if I was in number 10, I'd be thinking, oh, this is brilliant. I mean, how on earth is this happening? Well, it's happening because he's tapped into that realignment, which is not just rational choice. It's not just cost-benefit analysis.
And particularly if you said earlier the path ultimately leads towards sort of Central or Eastern Europe, a detached connection to political parties and identities. If that's the natural trajectory, where does that leave us in terms of the future of Western liberalism? Can we take one last question from Simon Cooper, your colleague, and then we'll wrap. Simon. I know there is. Well, I mean, so here's the great thing. Our speakers are staying. Our speakers are staying tonight and tomorrow, and tomorrow night. So I hear you. If we can maybe we can get to 2. You want to try? Let's try.
We can over.
Oh, hit that button, Simon. Yeah.
You alluded to this a couple of times in this excellent talk. Is it possible to say that the Tory party of Johnson is kind of uniting what was UKIP with, let's say, the Brexiter half of the Tory party into a new party that we'll have for a decade?
Yeah, exactly that. My hypothesis is Johnson will comfortably win the next election. We can talk later perhaps about why I think that's the case. Scotland, Labour. We're going back to 2014. We're going to have the perceived threat of a Labour SNP coalition put in front of everybody's faces. Johnson will do that to mobilise England against what he argues will be a sort of coalition of chaos. His electorate is ideally positioned to do that because it is overwhelmingly concentrated in England. Here's just something to remember. For Labour to win the next election, they've got to do what Clement Attlee did in 1945 or what Tony Blair did in 1997. Without Clement Attlee and without Tony Blair, right, it ain't going to happen. So that's going to give Johnson potentially until 2027, 2028, which then begs the question of what on earth will he do with it, because nobody really knows.
But they swallowed UKIP.
75% of UKIP's vote went to the Conservative Party at the last general election. Curiously, most of the remaining UKIPers went to the Liberal Democrats. We can discuss that.
Well, since you write for the Daily Telegraph and Sunday Telegraph, how about Anne Elizabeth Moutet? Would you take the last question, please?
Well, several questions. I don't want to take too much time, but essentially, let's leave aside the fact that I think that your figures for the decline of racism in Britain absolutely mirror the ones in France, and it's not perceived that way. My real question is about what we shan't call wokeness, but left modernism. And the question is, why has it penetrated universities, corporations, state intentions, local administrations, local councils, etc. This is the one thing that I cannot explain, and perhaps you do, because essentially you've got universities bowing down to demands, some of which are frankly ludicrous. You've got local councils sort of creating jobs, having to sort of watch out for something that may not exist. All of this costs money, time, and is not very much liked by most of their constituents, since there's the minority side. How is it that it was so successful in becoming institutional so fast?
Let's definitely get a glass of wine later on and talk in detail about this point, because I could talk all day about it. But if you want to know the costs of left modernism, great example in London. Local library just closed, okay? Can't afford to keep it open. £100,000 spent on anti-racism training for the local council staff. Now, you might say, Matt, that's a zero sum and you're painting an unfair comparison. Actually, I think it's the costs of this ideology. They're more interested in preaching and virtue signaling than they are in delivering core, fundamental, basic services like education. The university system, complex myriad of factors, but one of the most important was we decided student satisfaction means a lot more than the search for truth and objective knowledge. And so when a student says, I feel that I'm being emotionally harmed, the bureaucracy will kick into gear and meet their demands en masse, alongside a growing ideological imbalance, which from the 1960s to today has seen the share of conservatives in my country, for example, dwindle from about 34% to about 9%. Why would you go into academia today if you're on the right of the spectrum? It's not a particularly pleasant, enjoyable, or rewarding career. And alongside that, I think increasingly we've seen the radicalization of that monoculture. And Cass Sunstein and others have shown, when you have this monoculture over time, it tends to become a lot more radical. You have your 10 to 15% that are demanding very specific measures, and the moderates feel, for career purposes, that they can't stand up and say anything about it. I can't tell you how many emails I've had from junior faculty who will say, I agree with you, everything you say on issues around decolonizing the reading lists or turning universities into political brands rather than being sites of knowledge and understanding and learning. But they won't really say anything publicly, and because they are understandably concerned about their career progression. And that is why we've been campaigning on academic freedom. The answer, by the way, Thomas, I think, asked the question, what do you do about it? MIT and Princeton, fascinating comparison. MIT, the talk recently was cancelled by Abbott. Princeton then said they would host the talk, and I believe I'm right in saying they had 10,000 people register to attend that talk, which was going to be held on the same day, the same hour as the original one when it got, rejected. They didn't attract, Princeton did not attract the sort of intolerant mob because they knew it wouldn't work, right? Because they knew that the administration, the faculty were on side with preserving viewpoint diversity. And ultimately, if we want to prevent conservatives from doing what they've done today, which I actually disagree with, which is stepping outside of the university structures to start their own university, that is not the long-term answer to polarization. That is just parallel societies, and I don't think that's the way to go. But then we're going to have to empower the moderates within the universities to be able to stand up and not be discriminated against. Historically, I would have said to you, it's crazy to have government legislate on academic freedom. I don't want government anywhere near universities. But now, given the last 10 years, I've been won over by the argument that now actually what we need is an independent regulator who can fine universities when they violate academic freedom. And that's what we will have in the UK, I think by January, once the bill passes, which means Kathleen Stock, who you may have read about, in that instance, rather than being chased off campus by radical trans activists, bullied, harassed, and told by police that she's being, that her home was being watched, Kathleen can go to the independent regulator, can ask them to investigate the case and the university. More importantly, the university would have known that it has to promote academic freedom, it has to defend Kathleen Stock, otherwise it would risk being fined a large amount of money, and potentially also, if some genius entrepreneur out there creates an academic freedom league table, would start to fall down the league table and would be seen in a negative light. That is ultimately, I think that's the only way we can fix the problem, is actually intervening to ensure that the non-conformists are not chased off campus. And I'm happy to say lastly, I know Josh, you're bashing me on the time, but this autumn is really important for this debate. Symbolically, I don't agree with everything he says, but Jordan Peterson's going back to Cambridge after being disinvited in 2018. The academic freedom legislation is going through. We've seen the new university in the US, the creation of the Academic Freedom Alliance. This now needs to go global, right? This network of people who are actually standing up to the fringe minority, it needs to be a global effort to allow moderates to stand up and feel that they're going to be protected. And these are people I really disagree with. I don't agree with everything Kathleen says, and I don't agree with everything that Jordan says or Noah Carl says, but I fundamentally agree in the critical importance of academic freedom to our universities and to our students. Otherwise, we're just creating a generation that have not been exposed to different views, and that's not going to get us out of polarization. So. But anyway, we can talk a bit more later on maybe about that.
Well, Thank you, Ed, and thank you, Matt, very much, guys. It was really great.